The G20 summit has just concluded in Osaka, Japan, where leaders of the largest 20 economies in the world talked both economic matters and policies of global governance. The most eye-catching sideline meeting was between President Xi and President Trump, with the two sides agreeing to proceed with trade talks and not impose new tariffs. What are the implications for bilateral trade and the global economy? Well, the G20 summit opened broader prospects for the development of diplomatic ties. And what other issues were on the minds of world leaders? To talk about these, I'm very happy to be joined by Mr. He Weiwen, Senior Fellow from the Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies at Renmin University, and also Professor James Ray from California State University, Sacramento. We'll also talk to our correspondent Nathan King in Osaka via satellite. And as our topic, this is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. So one very important bilateral meeting on the sideline of the G20 is between President Xi and President Trump. They agreed that they will further their trade talks and the U.S. will not impose new tariffs on the Chinese side. What do you make of this agreement?
I think this is a very good outcome. And at the moment, the two top leaders made a political decision. First, come back to the negotiation table instead of fighting. Second, during this period, no new tariffs, no new actions will be taken. So leave the negotiation to the teams of the both governments.
But James, this happened actually in Buenos Aires just a year ago. They agreed not to impose new tariffs. They agreed to talk, but nothing happened.
I think it could have been worse today at the G20 if there had been acrimony or hostility, and the body language wasn't great, I thought, between the two leaders. But I'm not as optimistic that this is
not as warmer as Buenos Aires.
Yeah, and I'm not as optimistic that this will lead to any final resolution. I think Trump, in his statement, directly suggested he wanted a fair trade deal and that the parameters were kind of fixed, and it didn't lead me to believe he's willing to compromise, actually, despite his words.
So if both sides are not willing to make further concessions at this point, why the two leaders agreed to meet and make a political statement? They want to talk.
Well, I think they have a good personal relationship that's been built for these last several years. There are other issues like the Korean Peninsula, and global stability on a host of issues related to Iran and so forth, that U.S. and China are partners and need to work cooperatively. But I think that the trade deal could be made and should be made, but I don't think the Trump administration, and looking at the persons at the table from Peter Navarro to Wilbur Ross or even
Robert Lighthizer.
Yes, those are the persons that are, I don't think, interested in making a deal. I don't think they're interested in making a deal at all. And so I don't anticipate that.
But Mr. He, these people are the negotiators that Vice Premier Liu He got to face in the next round of negotiations. How can the Chinese convince the American side there's a line we must draw? Those things that you want it, like you want to put the law enforcement mechanism on legislation, which is basically impossible for the Chinese side to accept.
I think this really the point of the extreme difficulty in the talk between our two sides, because we have made our basic principles very clear. And those principles are just the opposite of the American principles. For instance, the Chinese side insists that all the new added tariffs must be dropped. That's the principle. While for the U.S. side, the tariffs are just the only most effective bargain they cannot drop. And then we say, you cannot interfere in our sovereignty. That means the government policies, the government governance. And the U.S. side says that you must change the government behavior and the industrial policies. And then we say the agreement must be equal. And for the American side, it's difficult because it is American first. Others must be second. And even if, in the case of increasing imports from America, of course, yes, of course we want. But the problem is China has already imposed the higher tariffs on 70% of U.S. exports to China. So in this case, the American exports are in a very bad, unfavorable competitive condition in competing with other countries. So how can they step up exports to China? So China must drop up the tariffs. And as a precondition, the Americans must drop the tariffs first. It's very difficult. So I believe that the negotiation will be difficult and will last 4 months.
But both the negotiating teams are present at the leaders' meeting. They understand that the leaders have expressed their will, political will, to resolve this problem. So in what areas, like Mr. He just mentioned, do you think the two sides might narrow their differences and come to some kind of agreement? James?
Well, on upholding intellectual property rules and the transfer of technology would be not as pressurized on the Chinese side. I mean, these are the areas that we got to in the 9 months ago or so on the process. But I don't think that the U.S. side really wants to reach the deal. And as Mr. He said, in sort of transforming the very basis of the Chinese industrial policy, that's what the American side is pushing for. And with the blacklisting of companies, the hostility toward Huawei, pushing American companies to move their facilities and global sourcing outside, even as the trade negotiations might go forward, there's a host of other tactics the U.S. is using that I think suggest it's moving farther. There's more balls in the air that are going to be hard to come to an agreement on anything that could be conclusive.
So you don't think it will be resolved anytime soon?
Optimistically would be next spring, where it would be helpful for President Trump to say he achieved a victory in the trade conflict with China.
Points.
Or it's the rest of his term, it's going to continue to escalate in hostility.
Okay. Let's hear what our man has to say on this. Nathan, you've been observing the bilateral meeting between Trump and President Xi in Osaka. How would you evaluate their meeting? Are the promises they made sincere, and what are the chances that will translate into a real deal? And what is your assessment of the G20 meeting this time in general in Osaka?
Well, let's start with your first question, and I think I'm more of a glass half full guy, and I thought that actually the outcome of what happened here in Osaka was actually more positive than a lot of people expected. And I was at the Donald Trump closing press conference, and his tone was very, very different when it came to China. He used words like strategic partner. That is not language that has been used about China in Washington, D.C., where I'm based for a long, long time, I can tell you. Also, I think that this idea of Huawei now being allowed to purchase U.S. tech going forward. Look, we've got to work out for the details, but the fact that he committed to that publicly is very significant. He has had hundreds of companies literally screaming in his ear or his administration's ear saying, we don't want to get a 20% hit on revenue. Our R&D centers in Asia are going to be affected. You're screwing up the global supply chains of the telecommunications industry, which is extremely integrated. The R&D benefits from Huawei won't come our way. And remember, tariffs have been raised in Washington and Beijing against each other, but China's been lowering tariffs essentially with everyone else. So U.S. businesses are becoming uncompetitive. Now, Donald Trump sounds like a plain man, but he does get this. And I do feel that even though essentially we now have a pause plus, like we saw in Buenos Aires, I think it's much more of a plus because we came to the brink in May where the 11th round of talks hit a wall, and it looked like we were going to have a massive escalation of tariffs. We did see the $250 billion go up from 10% to 25% of Chinese imports, but there's $300 billion that was threatening. We've had hearings on that. There was huge, overwhelming objections to that from U.S. companies. The administration is hearing that, and as our guest said, he is up for re-election soon in the U.S. election cycle. He needs to keep constituencies like farmers on board. Now, I'm not saying that the problems will go away, but what I'm saying is there is a much more serious approach that we've seen over the last couple of days from the administration. And remember, Donald Trump is the decider. He really doesn't mind switching. Even if Peter Navarro or Robert Lighthizer or Wilbur Ross say something different, if he sees it's in his interest to make a deal, he will.
What about the G20 summit this time in Osaka in general? Did they reach any agreement on WTO reform, climate change, healthcare, anything that you consider a breakthrough?
No, is the short answer. And, you know, obviously the China-US trade talks overshadowed a lot. On WTO reform, everyone agrees there should be WTO reform, and that's essentially where it stops. And that is the problem. You know, China making a case for developing countries, of course, but also its own application to be a market-based economy, that is essentially gone. The US essentially distrusts the WTO. You know that they've even stopped allowing judges to be appointed to the appellate panel. They essentially want the rules that essentially the US made up with the WTO, this current administration doesn't like. I think it's stuck completely. When it comes to rules for the digital economy of tomorrow, again, we see a split. The Japanese host really pushing this idea of data flows. But there are sovereignty issues. There are privacy issues. We've seen with the debate in the US and in China as well. It is a huge task for everyone. At least they're talking about it. I think, you know, the one area of agreement I would say is that they need to be looking at global pharmaceutical industry. There is some idea of progress on standards and some idea of pricing. That's a political issue everywhere. And then bringing more women into the workforce and women's empowerment. These are low-hanging fruit, if you like. But I think generally, if you look at the statement, it's very long. There's some weakness in the climate change language. Remember, Emmanuel Macron has essentially said, I really don't like this. You know, it doesn't fully reaffirm the Paris Climate Accord, of which the US, as you know, has pulled out. The US is leaning on Saudi Arabia and others not to support the climate change international framework. And then there's the word protectionism. You know, that doesn't, it's usually a G20 rejection. You know, of course, there's not protectionism, and there's been huge debate about that language as well. So we're seeing a very weak statement, if you like. I thought the Japanese host did a very good job of trying to square a circle, trying to find common areas where there aren't. But essentially, I think the thing that we can really say from the summit is that the US and China are restarting trade negotiations, and that's good for the global economy. But I don't think you can go far beyond that.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest good news coming out of the G20 this time. Thank you very much, Nathan, for your reporting from Japan. So, if this is the case, what do you think will finally convince the two sides to have a deal? Is it the economy, because both sides will suffer in the end, or is the politics, because obviously America is facing another election next year, and Trump wants something as a victory to claim for his next presidency. James?
Well, I think Nathan's correct that we don't know what Trump would do, and he can change his mind, and I think he would want to get a deal. I think he wants to get a deal, and we saw his daughter Ivanka at the table and Steve Mnuchin as Treasury Secretary.
But how much does he want that deal?
I think he's
what
very
cost?
influenced by the hardliners in his administration, and I think they have been able to convince him that these years of cooperation have allowed, as he said in his first meeting when he came to Beijing, 30 years American presidents have been too weak and let China win. I think his view is protectionism, trade war, tariffs is the path.
Do you think in his mind reaching a deal with China will make him look weak because he has terms that not as strong as many hawkish figures think it would be?
I think it's a risk because on the Democratic side they're even more hostile to free trade, and they might be even more critical to China, particularly looking at the candidates that are pushing on that side. So we're going to have again an election cycle. China always becomes a target of American presidential candidates, and so I don't think even as I said, a victory that he could claim on a trade deal necessarily is that helpful for him in the industrial states that vote, who feel that their jobs have been offshored. They're not pro-China voters in America, and he's going to be appealing to them. So we probably have to wait till after the election.
And Mr. He, the WTO already stated in its report that the tariff increases initiated by the U.S. have roiled financial markets, but they have not yet led to significant trade and GDP impacts. And that's probably why Americans are still insisting on their tariff policies, because it hasn't hurt their real economy yet, and their jobs' picture is still pretty good.
This, Yes, there are differences because of the passing time tempo, because the market is sensitive. It's a financial market, not a financial sector. Financial markets feel the changes very quickly, so they give responses. Then it takes time to pass on to the trade and the real economy. However, the real economy and trade is being affected already. For instance, the IMF has still already revised down the forecast for GDP growth of the globe for 2019 by 0.4 percentage point to 3.3, the lowest since the global financial crisis. The president of IMF, Christine Lagarde, said that the overall trade war could bring down the global GDP growth by half to a full percentage point.
But will it affect the American economy?
Yes,
and
it's
make
already,
Americans
I
suffer?
think, yes. Of course, Q1 of 2019, the American GDP grew by 3.1%. That's good. Okay, let's analyze, articulate the fundamentals, consumer expenditure, and fixed investment combined. They are fundamentals. Just pushed GDP by 1.1 percentage point, just half as the last quarter of last year. Because most of the contributions came from the adjustment of inventory, from the real net export and the government expenditures. But the fundamentals are personal expenditure and fixed investment. That's crucial. And this trend still continues since into the second quarter. I believe the second quarter data would be bad. It would be worse than the first quarter.
As Nathan mentioned, those people attending the hearing of USTR, they complained that those tariffs will hurt the American economy and consumers at last. Will these translate into political pressure and persuade President Trump to think otherwise, despite the resistance from Lighthizer and Peter Navarro?
Well, I agree with Mr. He. There is certainly pressure already. The tariffs China put on kind of targeted sectors, agriculture and so forth, were biting, and then the tariffs the U.S. has put on has hurt American importers and exporters. There is pressure from Wall Street, there's pressure from ordinary Americans, but that's been for more than a year, that pressure, and President Trump has tried to compensate them with some of revenue, but I don't think it's going to be that impactful. In the equation, again, of the political side is working class voters who may not feel it as directly in the short term. I think it's going to be a long-term consequence. And the stock market, because the economy is starting to slow in America, interest rates may be cut, and the stock market's at an all-time high, and I think that's the benchmark Trump and some of the public looks at as the stock market index, which is kind of going inverts with the actual economy, which is slowing and jobs are slowing.
I want to talk about the G20 mechanism itself. G20 is basically a multilateral mechanism. It is supposed to solve the financial crisis in 2008. How do you evaluate the efficiency of this institution? Has it evolved to solve any global problems as people wished?
Over the last 10 years, the G20 mechanism, at the top level, state leaders level, changed quite a lot. The role of any specific mechanism changes with time, place, and context. 10 years ago, during the global financial crisis, all the countries were on the same boat. The boat was likely to sink, and it's critical for them to adopt urgent measures to supply liquidities, to save from the financial difficulties. That's correct and effective. But 10 years later, the boat is not likely to sink, and the interests of different countries fall apart.
So everybody is fending for themselves.
Yes. So I don't think that the G20 mechanism is as effective as before. So now we can see from the Osaka summit that G20 has become more and more an umbrella. Under the umbrella, there are different diplomat activities, bilateral, or regional, or plurilateral, and for their specific purposes. I think that might be the involvement of the G20 roles.
But it still serves as a platform for leaders, for world leaders to talk about those basic issues affect their economies. Do you think European leaders, Asian leaders, and American leaders have agreed on where the world economy is headed, and what is the rule of the game should be, James?
If not for the Trump administration, I think we'd look at this very differently. We would see China and Japan with positive bilateral steps in this bilateral series of meetings. I think China's continuing to move toward reform and opening and participating in WTO, climate change, the host of multilateralism. I mean, for many years, the U.S. criticized China for not participating in multilateral reforms, and now China's a key actor. I think the Europeans are aligned with China, with Japan, even some of the emerging economies. And if the U.S. was, from 2 years ago, under President Obama, in favor of free trade and climate change, I think we'd be celebrating the G20 because of its diversity, its inclusion. But instead, the U.S. is kind of, well, not kind of, very dramatically hostile to multilateralism in all forms, and that really is trying to drive a wedge in Europe, among European leaders, in Asia, and so it's undermined the G20. But I think the G20 has, the staying power once, presuming things sort of return to normal.
So let's talk about those bilateral relations. For example, China-Japan. It is unimaginable just 7 years ago to talk about a closer relations between China and Japan because of many issues. But now, China and Japan has been trying to forge closer ties. President Xi and Prime Minister Abe spoke highly of the momentum in the development, and they will probably meet again. What do you make of the warming up of the relations between China and Japan, Mr. He?
I think there are three different significance at different dimensions. First, bilateral. Both countries need to cooperate to promote their economies during the global context of difficulties and uncertainties. So the two countries will step up their economic, cultural, technology, and people-to-people exchanges and cooperation. That's one. And the second is regional. China and Japan have realized that they should take a lead and play more active roles in the regional development in Asia and Asia Pacific. So both sides have the common stand and a common approach, so that's easier for us to cooperate. For instance, we can work together to step up infrastructure and investment in Asia and along the Belt and Road, although Japan does not call it that way. And thirdly, important, multilateral. Both China and Japan support multilateralism, support free trade, support the multilateral trading system with WTO at core. So that gives us the common ground. We work together for the same goal.
And you don't believe America has a role to play here, because the Trump administration obviously is turning away from multilateralism, which Japanese are not so comfortable with, and that's why the Japanese chose to get closer with China.
I think that's a very important factor. For instance, the Trump administration just quit TPP, but Japan insisted, and the changes moved it into CPTPP. And China worked together with Japan, and then Japan and China has picked up the momentum for the tripartite free trade agreement with Korea. So if we push together with the tripartite FTA, that will be phenomenal.
I want to pin you down on this, because they have just signed in April an agreement to cross the exchange trade funds. That means they will have more capital cooperation in this front. Does that mean we're getting closer to a free trade deal with Japan and South Korea?
That's different. That's capital market. It's different from trade. And at current, let's step up the cooperation between the two countries on the capital market. And also, Japan and China. Japan, 10 years ago, proposed the idea of Asia dollar that's based on yen and renminbi. And that's not only for supporting the regional integration, but also step up for the regional contingency arrangement for the balance of payments crisis in case. And also, I don't think the bilateral free trade agreement between China and Japan is on the agenda for the moment. On the agenda, which is on the agenda, is the three parties, China, Japan, and South Korea. And then also China and Japan will step up efforts to promote RCEP, making it a deal as early as possible. I think this is the main area that we are working on.
So what I'm trying to ask is that, James, when America is walking away from multilateral agreement and setting up barriers between itself and the rest of the world, do you think the rest of the world, Europe, Asia, will try to integrate better?
Well, I think Japan has that real dilemma, and I think Prime Minister Abe on day one of Trump's election called him, really wanted to align his government with the U.S., but with the withdrawal from the TPP, with President Trump here at this summit and prior criticizing the Mutual Defense Treaty with Japan, and really not building that relationship. I think Prime Minister Abe cannot have faith that the U.S. is going to be there to build the kind of institutions that it did 20 years ago with APEC and so forth. China will be here. China is going to be the leading economy, and with the AIIB, which Japan didn't join, China has created some of these architectures that I think Japan will now have to partner with, and I mean was never going to isolate itself from China, but I think it can't have the same faith in the United States from either party. And for the other countries, I think if the U.S. wants to isolate China, which I think is really part of the agenda here, President Trump insults the Europeans on NATO, insults the G7, insults Canada, insults the allies. So he's not building a global coalition to isolate China. In fact, China is really better positioned to, I think.
But security-wise, the U.S., India, and also Japan, they have met this time in Osaka, try to reinforce the message of the Indo-Pacific strategy. You don't think that strategy will pull through?
I think it's faltering. I don't think I think Trump's focus is trade. We saw with the Iran case, he's reluctant to use force. I don't think he really wants to take a belligerent stance on South China Sea or moving India more military. I don't think that's his personal agenda. And as that kind of is dislocated, India is also being challenged on trade by the United States. India is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's no guarantee that India wants to remain devoutly loyal to the United States in the way Japan has. China's working very hard with India. Russia, China, India, that's an important relationship here in the region. And so I think India has the same dilemma. Is the U.S. going to back up this kind of military aggressive posture with the Indo-Pacific framing?
Okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about Russia. Russian leaders and Chinese leaders have once again reiterated that the importance of China-Russia relationship. What do you make of the term, this is the best relationship ever in history?
Yes, I think if we recall the history of the past 70 years between China and the Soviet Union and then Russia, we can find that at the moment we have the best relations because we don't have the major differences and we all have shared a common interest. Not only in bilateral interest, because we want to step up our trade volume. We already broke $100 billion barrier and want to double it towards the $200 billion. That's vast areas for cooperation economically. But more than that, globally, we are two important players in safeguarding world peace and upholding multilateralism centered with the United Nations. So that's crucial and important. The two big countries should work together to support world peace and prosperity and support multilateralism. That's the most important one.
And on the other hand, while China and Russia have been enjoying the best relationship ever, a Russian leader and American leaders are meeting this time in Osaka, but it's kind of awkward because the reporter is asking President Trump, will you ask President Putin not to meddle with our politics? And he jokingly asked Putin that. This is the first time they've met after the Mueller investigation results was announced. What do you think Russia and U.S. relations will go next?
Well, I mean, I think the consensus in American foreign policy is to be very clear that the U.S. demands Russia not interfere in the coming election, that any meddling in Ukrainian politics is off limits, even the Crimean annexation. These are still issues in the Republican and Democratic side for U.S. foreign policy. But I don't think Trump is pushing those kind of issues.
No.
And I think we see his fondness for Vladimir Putin.
All right. We're running out of time. Thank you very much, James. Thank you, Mr. He. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Goodbye.